Okay, so in this second part of our module 3, we're talking about selecting an analysis. And so we framed our hypothesis and we want now to test it statistically. And so what are the factors that matter? And so the first one I want to talk about is assumptions. Um, Various statistical tests will be based on assumptions about your data, basically. And so if you think back of the example of the coin, we compared the result of our coin with a certain distribution, a binomial distribution. So this was the underlying assumption, right? If we're testing for, if we're using a test that requires normal distribution, that's one of the assumptions. It's very important because all the math behind the test will use certain characteristics and certain formulas that are only valid if those assumptions are true. And so the first one that you will very often see and that is required in most statistical tests, or a lot of them, is independent samples. Now, what does mean independent samples? It means that when you measure one thing, one sample, and then the next, the variability from sample to sample is not linked. So I'll give you an example. You're trying to figure out the um, average length of fingers in, I don't know, a new species of monkey. And you record each of the fingers, one hand, let's say, of 100 monkeys. So uh, 5 times 100, 500. Is your sample size 500 or is your sample size 100 because you have 100 monkeys? Well, the fingers of one individual's, their length tends to be correlated. So if you're trying to see how the finger length varies across the population, it's it's wrong to think that the samples, the digits on one individuals are independent samples. They're not independent. If you take a giant, one of the largest animal in the species, his their fingers is going to be taller, and then you'll have five longer, and then you'll have five samples with these extra long fingers, but those are not independent samples, okay? So independent samples, that's something that you have to think about when you design your experimental setup, okay? You can't take repeated measure on the same individual, for example, and say they're different measures, right? Okay. The other one I mentioned already, normality, whether the data is Gaussianly distributed or not. Remember, we have a test we can use to test that. Um, and this is very important because, again, a lot of statistical tests will rely on this, the function, the math of the normal distribution to be able to calculate probabilities that you have certain kind of sample data, right? Um, and especially a lot of tests rely on this because, as we said before, the normal distribution is a fairly simple function, simple distributions, where you have two parameters, the mean and the variance, and with these two parameters, they find the function perfectly, and so it's easier to do the math than if you have more variables. So this is a very common assumption. Um, Now, this word is a mouthful. Homoscedasticity. No, homoscedasticity. Okay, I want to ask you to pronounce it. It means equal variance. I want you to recognize it. If you see it somewhere, well, you have to know that it means equal variance. Okay, there are tests also for that. Specifically, you can do an F test, it's called, to make sure that your different groups have equal variance. So you don't want to have one group that doesn't vary a lot and another group that has a very wide variability, and then compare them with tests that assumes equal variance. Another one that I wanted to mention that's common in several types of analysis, including regressions and correlations, it assumes linearity. So linearity means that the relationship between two variables is a sort of simple line relationship. So if you think back to basic math, y equals ax plus b, so the relationship between y and b, y and x is a simple line. So a being the slope of that line, b being the offset. And so if you remove the offset, you remove b, basically y equals ax, right? So you just scale x and you get y. Uh, So that's a linear relationship, and a lot of math can be based on the assumption that this is the kind of relationship you have. If you think that's not true, you can do other types of analysis, of regression analysis, for example, that rely on nonlinear functions. It's typically a little bit more complicated, but it's possible. Okay, um, so the next part I want to cover here is the idea that you will not learn about all the statistical tests that are available and that you might need to use. Okay, and so it is important to understand the jargon of those tests, and especially the assumptions and what kind of data it applies to, because you will have to basically search for it. I think even experienced scientists still search commonly for the right test for their data. And so you have to think of your data, try to think if it answers the assumptions of the typical statistical test. And if it doesn't, then you have to sort of search and find one where the assumptions are met. And so I give you an example here. If I was to look up a t-test, these are the assumptions. So independence, normality, uh, homoscedasticity, so equal variance, homogeneity of variance. And so these are the common ones. You have this other one, the man-Newton U-test. So so here, continuous variable, uh, independent, two independent categorical group. So it starts to be, specific. You have independent variables, two of them, and they're in categorical groups, so nominal, right? Observation should be independent, and observation are normally distributed. Um, so, and sorry, observation that not normally distributed. So if you can't do something like a t-test, maybe you can do this, because here you don't need to have a normal distribution. But they have to have the same shape. So very specific hypothesis. Basically, Google or libraries or things like that are your friend. And here I have an example. I know that if I have data that are angles, well, that's a problem, because angles are not sort of normal. It's not normally distributed. It's um, not typically normally distributed. And if you're at 365 degrees, then it might come back to 0 degree, right? If you turn around, the degrees, the angles don't keep going up. It typically resets after 365 degrees. And so your angles are weird. And so you have to think, okay, well, probably I need some special math about that. And so you can Google it, statistical test with angles, and you'll find a Riley test, for example, I think, if I remember well, with the assumptions of that test. Okay, so you'll have to be able to Google stuff and understand the result and think about your data. Because really, it's the characteristics of your data and the groups and how the data is structured that will set the test you want to use. And so I have this little key to selecting statistical tests. Here I have really only the very basic test, but very often this will be enough. And so the two big things you have to ask yourself is, first you have to think of dependent variable and independent variable, and you have to think about whether those variables are nominal or continuous, so categories or a continuous measurement, right? So remember your independent variables, or it could be codependent, but you know, one variable versus the other. Um, if you have, um, it's easier to think of dependent and independent, and so if your independent variable is nominal, so a category, you have two types of treatment, but your dependent variable, your measurement, is continuous, then you have these two tests. They're sort of the go-to. T-test and ANOVA is actually, ANOVA is better because ANOVA does everything that T-tests do, and so um, we will focus a lot on the class on ANOVAs. It's probably one of your most powerful and flexible tests out there. Now these two require a normal distribution. It's called parametric. Parametric means you have the parameter of the normal distribution that you can that the math takes into account. And if that's not true, if you don't have a normal distribution, you have to go to the non-parametric test. And the equivalent here are well, typically the Kruskal-Wallis will be the equivalent of an ANOVA, and the Mann-Whitney or the Wilcoxon will be the equivalent of a t-test. Notice that you can do the same thing here. You can use a t-test if you're comparing like a mean against a single number. And so that's the little caveat or the little addition I have here. If both of your data are nominal, you have a g-test or a chi-square. If your independent variable is continuous, but your dependent variable is nominal, like let's say you have dose of a drug that you vary continuously across a wide spectrum, and the outcome, let's say it's a painkiller, the outcome is the Likert scale, pain level, very unhappy smiley face or very happy smiley face. Then you need to do a logic regression. If your independent variable is continuous, but your output is continuous, so let's take the same pain medicine example, and you rather than measuring a Likert scale, you have something that's you measure the level of cortisol in the blood. Okay, so you have a continuous output. You can do a regression or a correlation analysis. Notice here that if you compare two variables that are continuous, but basically your independent variable is not really something part of your design. It's you're testing against a known distribution. Let's say, is my dependent variable normally distributed? It's a goodness of fit test. So the Kolmogorov Smirnov test we talked about, that's fits in this category here. Okay. So understanding this and being able to use it and remembering the name of the main test, we're going to focus on this box or this whole box here and this one here. Okay. Having a dependent variable that's nominal is a little bit less. In a lot of life science, you have a continuous dependent variable, and so that's why we focus on this, and there's more tools. We're going to cover very few tools in the class. The point is to be able to understand the requirement of the different tests, and if you can run one test, then typically adjusting to another test is not very complicated. Okay, make sure you look at the concepts that we covered, and you can answer a question about this. Next, we'll look at the result of our statistical analysis and how the probabilities that it gives us can allow us to do a conclusion about the hypothesis. Thank you.